Peace, everybody. Finna do this video today. Before I do that, I want to promote my website, enigma.com. The link is in the description. I publish magazines and books, and I create t-shirts, and I design t-shirts and stuff like that. And I want to make a special request from the Joe Biden voters, the so-called black people who voted for Joe Biden, who told them that you ain't black if you don't vote for me. No policy, no promises. You went out there and made this man a president of the United States with control over trillions of dollars to give to everybody but you. Because you did that, if you don't go to my website, you ain't black. All right. The topic today is we don't have enough information and evidence to believe anything about ourselves and our history. The things that we learn about our history is controlled by the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the Department of Interior, and many other departments design your history for your particular function and to control your actions. Farrakhan say, whoever prescribes the diameter of your information, your knowledge, controls the circumference, the circumference of your movement. So they prescribes the diameter of your information. So they control how far you can go, basically. So I want to discuss, I think, 4 different books that leads me to my conclusions. And plus, I want to discuss other things other than just the books. I thought about it early before this video, so I want to recompile this information because I haven't written it. I just thought about it. So this leads me to the truth that everything we learn is fake about ourselves, the black people. And nobody is telling us this because all of the concurrent monarchies who existed before the 1800s were either conquered, destroyed, or changed. So they can't come and tell us who we are. But it was a particular man who was sent from Arabia. Before it was called Saudi Arabia, it was called Arabia under the Ottoman Empire. Farad Muhammad came to America and established the lost foundation of Islam and taught us that we was part of a global Islamic empire and we have been lost. And he came to find us. He was sent by his father. So that's one indication. This happened in the 1920s. He was here way before the 1920s. But the first book that everybody should read is a book by Niccolo Machiavelli called The Prince. It was written and published in the 1500s, which is the 16th century. And the reason for its publishing was the Medici family was removed from power from Pope Alexander in 1493. And Pope Alexander and his son, Caesar Borgia, were failures. So they decided to reinstitute the Medici family. And the person that was a descendant of the previous king, his name was Lorenzo the Magnificent Medici. And he didn't have any knowledge of being a king because his family was stripped. So Niccolo Machiavelli wrote this book to teach him how to be a king, right? Teach him how to be a prince, because a prince is just a king. That's a name, a different name for king is prince. As you control different principalities, right? And he was talking about the different countries and how you can control them and how you can conquer them. One thing he said was, it's impossible to conquer a religious principality because God is the king of those, so you just leave them alone. But he was talking about, in particular, this would disturb me about this book. He talked about how to conquer France. He say France is so old, has so many people loyal to them, it's impossible to conquer them without killing off the entire royal family, killing off all the people loyal to the royal family. And then, this is the key right here, you got to change the people's history and teach them that you always been the ruler. So they have no idea of what happened before you came because you destroyed the entire history and rewrote it. And at the time he wrote this book, in the 1500s. See, he wasn't talking about the France that's in Western Europe, because most of the United States of America at that time in the 1500s was considered France. It was called New France. It was an alliance between the Indians, the American Indians, the Algonquin, and the French monarchy. And it went from New Orleans. No, it went from Haiti. Haiti was actually part of it. But in the land of America, it started from New Orleans, which is the port of the Mississippi River, into Canada, over 100 million square miles of land that was co-ruled by the Algonquin and the French, because both of them were monarchies. They just was cool with each other for whatever reason. That's why so many people in the Midwest is mixed with French and Indian, you know. And they lost New France in the late 1700s. And allegedly, this happened after they killed off the French in the French Revolution. They basically did what Machiavelli said they had to do. And allegedly Napoleon sold New France to Thomas Jefferson for $15 million, which is the so-called Louisiana Purchase. But the reason I thought of that book was he told them to do exactly what happened to us, because the black people in America, because we know about the so-called freedom fighters of the 1800s, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, stuff like that. But they can't tell you not one person who was a so-called black freedom fighter in the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. So you would have to either assume that the black people were subjugated for 300 years before they had the courage to fight back, or everything is fake. We weren't so-called slaves until after the American Revolution, when they reinstituted slavery. That was the purpose of the American Revolution, because there's a book that most of y'all probably never heard of. It's called the Le Code Noir, the Black Codes. It was written in the 1600s and the 1500s. It was written by King Louis the 13th and 14th. The purpose of this book was to abolish illegal slavery in all the French territories, which was the Americas, and to re-enfranchise all of the people that were victims of slavery, enfranchise them into the empire. And if you read this book, it's actually, you got to translate this book. They got Google Translate, you get it translated. They talked about in the Louisiana Constitution, because Louisiana had a constitution, they abolished all Jews in all French territories in the whole world, because the Jews were the one who actually were doing the illegal slavery. The French monarchy actually freed the people from slavery in all of the territories, including Haiti. See, when they talk about Toussaint Overture and the French Revolution, that was against Napoleon, because Haiti was freed from slavery 100 years prior, back so-called King Louis the 14th and the Le Code Noir, the Black Codes. You see what I'm saying? And also that included so-called New France, which went from New Orleans to Canada. They abolished illegal slavery, and Jews couldn't go into those territories until after the American Revolution, until after the French Revolution. That's when Jews was able to go into their territories, because they were the ones who was the slave owners. So that is 2 books. Another book I want to talk about, who actually led me to believe these things about everything is fake. I read a book called The History of the Moors in Spain by Stanley Lane Poole. It was published in the late 1800s. It talked about how the Vandals were the ones who controlled Spain, because the Vandals was the ones who conquered the Roman Empire, you know. And this was a time in 711 AD, when Islam kind of took over the world. Everybody became Muslims, the religion of freedom and peace. And it's talking about how the king of the Vandals, they called it Vandalusia, he was actually raping the generals of his army's daughter. And she told the general of the army what the king was doing. But the king didn't let the general didn't let the king know that he knew. So when Tariq the Great came to conquer Vandalusia, this is what they teach. This could be fake. They say the general just let him in. Just let him conquer because he was against the Vandals. He just let him conquer. That's why it was so easy for them to take it. This is what they teach. This could be fake. So the Moors went up there and just wiped the Vandals out easily. And then they tried to go into France. And the French stopped them at the border. They had equal power. So they just stopped right there. They just were satisfied with conquering Vandalusia, which was Carthage at one point, part of Carthage. So they reconquered the land. They came from Morocco and reconquered Spain. So this is not the reason I'm talking about it. The reason I'm talking about it is France and Spain are right next to each other. They only discussed one war between France and the Moors in 900 years. So they was able to coexist next to each other as neighbors for 900 years without having a major war. And after the war, after so-called, after the Moors were kicked out of Spain, a lot of them went to France as refuge because they had three ultimatums. They could be slaves, they could become Christians, or they could be killed. Or they could leave, they could go into exile. A lot of them chose to leave because they thought being a Christian was the most disgusting thing in the world because Christians didn't take baths. They bragged about being nasty and filthy. When they conquered Spain from the Moors, one of the first things they did was to destroy the bath houses and the running water because they loved filth. But the French monarchy never had a problem with the Moors. And after they was exiled and put into captivity, the so-called French monarchy followed the Spanish around the world and set up colonies too. And they was the first ones, because when we read this book by Stanley Lane Poole, the History of the Moors of Spain, when the Moors conquered Vandalusia, one of the first things they did, they abolished slavery in 711 AD. And all of the people that worked on the farms were immediately enfranchised into the government. They became members of society, tax-paying people. Because before that, they were slaves. All the farmers were slaves to the Vandals. You had a middle class who paid all the taxes, and the Vandals just living lavishly, just like America. But the Moors enfranchised everybody, and whoever became Muslims were tax-free. So that was an extra incentive for them to accept Islam, that they didn't have to pay any taxes. But all the other people who didn't want to pay taxes, who didn't want to be Muslims, they just had to pay taxes. You see what I'm saying? But the thing is, in 900 years, they never had a major conflict with the French, who was right next to them. That's another key right there. So that's two books. Another book I wanted to talk about. No, I don't want to talk about that book. Another book I want to talk about to lead me to believe this. It was written by Booker T. Washington. He was a slave in the 1800s, around the time of the Civil War, the American Civil War. So Booker T. Washington, as a child, was in transition from slavery to freedom. But he witnessed what happened during slavery. He discussed, how they didn't have clothes. Him and his brother only had one shirt to wear, to share with each other, stuff like that. But when he became free, when he started teaching, I skipped a lot of stuff, but he started teaching at Hampton University, and he was commissioned to teach Indians, to Indian children. And he noted that when they went to certain areas, the Indian children were always treated better by Caucasians than he were. But he said, we look the same. There's no difference in how we look. He didn't see why they was treating them better. But we know why they were treating them better, because the Indian children knew their identity. They knew who they were. And he said, Booker T. Washington said in his book, Up From Slavery, he said the Indians looked at white people as the scum of the earth. That's how the black Indians, because they was black people. This is what Booker T. Washington described them as. He said they looked at white people as the lowest scum. The Indian children he was commissioned to teach when he was a teacher at Hampton University. But all of these things is telling me, I know there's a couple of books I didn't want to talk about, a couple of books because they're not relevant. But these 3 books that I just discussed is telling you that our so-called captivity in America is not what they're telling us. Our captivity started with the Western expansion. The Caucasians started expanding westward after the American Revolution. They created a document called the Ordinance of 1787. You could read this ordinance. They talked about the Indian cannot lose their land unless you get permission, like you purchase it, or if you take them to a just war. So a lot of these Caucasians started traveling westward, starting wars with so-called Indians in order to steal their land, because that was written, so-called law. Then they gave them the information on how to set up states and cities and governments when they do conquer this land, this so-called land that they got from the Indians. They called them Indians. And what do you think happened when they took these Indians to war? Just started wars with, and I read a book when I was in the library downtown in Chicago, here at Washington Library. The Caucasians described the houses that the Indians lived in. They say they lived in these massive houses, these massive estates, huge houses. And they would go in there and burn houses down, waging war, killing women and children, and just taking their cities, taking their land, all westward from the 13 colonies. And this is the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s. And when they got to Chicago, because Chicago was part of the so-called New France, the Algonquin, the Potawatomi, they tried to start a war with the Indians in Chicago called the War 1812. But the United States lost. They lost the War 1812. So they never conquered Chicago. That's why in Chicago and Cook County, you can never own land. You could just pay taxes because the land still belongs to the Indians, because they was given permission to live here with the stipulation that they had to pay the descendants money forever. There was the agreement, the Treaty of Chicago. You look up the Treaty of Chicago. The Native Americans had in that treaty, they had to pay money forever, so they could never own nothing here. But this explains to me why the black people became slaves in the 1800s. When they traveled westward to conquer land, according to the Ordinance of 1787, they didn't kill everybody. You always got prisoners after you actually conquer a land. So this is how the so-called black people became slaves when they traveled westward from the 13 colonies and went into Indian territory. They conquered the people, killed the people, and put them in prison, slavery, sent them down. Like the movie 12 Years a Slave show you that. They got a guy from New York City and put him in slavery down south. This is how the black people became slaves in America in the 1800s, because none of your scholars can mention not one person, so-called black freedom fighter in the 1700s. The so-called black people in the 1700s were founding and designing cities, engineers, architects. Now I could tell you about a slave rebellion that happened in the 1600s, Bacon's Rebellion. The Caucasians rebelled because the so-called Indians was so-called oppressing them, and the so-called British governor over Virginia so-called didn't protect them. So the Caucasians went over there, led by Bacon, a so-called Negro who wasn't a slave, because the Caucasians worked with slaves on a tobacco plantation in the 1600s, because they came over here to be servants, you know. But Bacon wasn't a slave, but he was a dumb Negro that helped them rebel against the so-called British monarchy, because they had governors. They was called Commonwealth. The 13 colonies were called 13 Commonwealths, and they all had a governor over them. And they were all under King Charles. And the governor, I think, was Virginia. That's when it happened. Ordered all of the rebels to be executed after they did Bacon Rebellion. And King Charles, I think the second, told him, "You ain't gonna do nothing but make them martyrs." That's what he said. He said you shouldn't have executed all of them, but all of them that did Bacon Rebellion, all them Caucasians, was executed. And you can look this up. Look up Bacon Rebellion, 1675. Caucasians rebelling against slavery. And they was helped by a free Negro. But that's about it.